Mr. Ward.
My lady, our next witness today is Mr. Steve Barclay.
Take the Bible in your right hand, please, and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
I hope we haven't kept you waiting too long, Mr. Barclay.
Not at all, my lady.
Please state your full name for the inquiry.
Stephen Paul Barclay.
Mr. Barclay, thank you for providing to the inquiry a witness statement. It's an inquiry 000574180, which you've signed. Could you confirm to the inquiry that it's true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
I can.
Thank you for that. We know from it, Mr. Barclay, that from the 13th of February 2020 until the 15th of September 2021, you served as Chief Secretary to His Majesty's Treasury,
Correct.
or CSM, or CST as the abbreviation goes. For the duration of the period that's within the scope of the inquiry, you also served as Chancellor to the Duchy of Lancaster from the 15th of September 2021 to July 2022. And of possible relevance as we get on to other matters in a few moments, you had two stints serving as Secretary of State for the Department of Health and Social Care, first from the 5th of July to the 6th of September 2022, and also from the 25th of October to the 13th of November 2023.
Correct.
All right, thank you. Now, I want to establish first with you, if I may, the role of the CST, which is something that you address in your written evidence. It's a ministerial office within the government and the second most senior ministerial office within the Treasury. That's right, isn't it?
It is.
And that person, for the relevant period, you reported to the Chancellor.
Correct.
Yeah. The CST is responsible for public expenditure, which includes spending reviews and strategic planning, in-year spending control, public sector pay and pensions, efficiency and value for money in public service and procurement. And those are the areas within its remit that are most relevant to public procurement generally and emergency public procurement in particular. That's right, is it not? Your day-to-day duties in that role involved you in interdepartmental and Treasury meetings, stakeholder engagement, budget management, and also you had decision-making authority, including in relation to approving budgets and influencing economic and fiscal policies, all of that under the guidance of the Chancellor.
Correct.
In that role, you also used procurement principles and regulations, which are codified in the government document Managing Public Money, and sets out the main principles for dealing with resources in the public sector organisations within the UK.
Correct.
That's right. All right, I want to now put up on the screen a couple of paragraphs from the opening within this module and a graph with which you may well be familiar. So the references for that are, firstly, PHT 000000149, and it's pages 1 to 2. The level of spending on healthcare equipment was not anticipated by anyone, including His Majesty's Treasury. To take the example of PPE alone, and you, of course, Mr. Barclay, were involved in more than just PPE, but here to take the example of PPE alone, the Treasury's spending envelopes, that is the total amount of money it plans to spend over a set period of time, expanded 138-fold from 100 million to 13.8 billion. Yes?
Correct.
And that is illustrated. Let's just move on before we go to the graph to the next paragraph, or page 5 from 9 on, starting these sums. These sums, vast as they are, have understandably been the subject of considerable public interest and media attention, one of the questions which has been and continues to be posed is whether during the course of the crisis which faced the country, the public purse was exploited for personal gain by those with close connections to government and officials. There has been a substantial amount of public discourse about whether there was corruption, cronyism and misuse of public money carried out under cover of protecting frontline health and social care workers, as well as the public from COVID-19 infection. The inquiry had considered not only referrals by those with connections to the then Conservative Party, but also those with political parties, including the Labour Party. Now, it's principally the first paragraph that I wanted to draw to your attention, but as we will move to, and I know you address in your written evidence, the Treasury, and you particularly, did have some degree, some role in guarding against the misuse of public funds, didn't you?
I did.
Yeah. So let's now turn to that graph. It's INQ 000474916. I don't know whether you are familiar with this. You may even have seen it on day one of this module. Are you familiar with it?
Not particularly this one, but obviously the underlying message, yes, that spending increased extremely quickly.
Extremely quickly, and even beyond the date by which PPE expenditure was tailing off, if not finishing, June or July of that year.
Yes.
Yeah. And likewise, expenditure on ventilators had already taken place by that period.
It had.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. I think that can now be taken down, but it helps us frame the degree of spending increases or spending envelopes over that period. You tell us in your statement that during the relevant time, the Treasury's role was on one of overseeing public spending, but that was often delegated to AOs, accounting officers, given the urgent pace at which decisions were required. Now, presumably, Mr. Barclay, the role of overseeing was made extremely difficult in these circumstances. Is that fair?
Yes, it is.
And once one delegates to AOs, the decisions that were made about expenditure, one is, in effect, removing oneself within the Treasury from that role of oversight. There's a limited degree of oversight that can, in practical terms, be achieved once that transfer of roles is done.
It becomes the accounting officer's decision, yes.
Yeah. To what extent, if any, was that decision-making process supervised, monitored, the subject of guidance from within the Treasury?
Well, firstly, delegated envelopes are part of the consistent managing public money approach. I think, Mr. Ward, what you're drawing attention to is the vast increase in the delegated envelopes and the speed at which that envelope increased over a short period of time. And I think that needs to be viewed in the context of the pandemic that the country was facing, the scale of the challenge, and the imperative from the Prime Minister and the Quad, who ultimately set the envelope. My job as Chief Secretary is then to go and implement those decisions. But the decision on spending of that size, up to over 13 billion for England, over 15 billion across the United Kingdom, is set by the Prime Minister with the Chancellor. That decision reflected the imperative, which was to focus on saving lives. And that was what drove that increase. And I'm sure we will come on to the various stages of that.
Is the spending envelope basically the Treasury, on the authority of the Prime Minister, saying you can spend up to this amount but no more? I mean, a budget would normally be, we expect you to spend about 30 million or whatever. But an envelope seems to me, it's slightly different, isn't it?
So conditions will be attached to the envelope, and one of the key mitigations that the Treasury put in place was to impose conditions alongside that increase. But the envelope then gives the accounting officer authority to spend within that quantum. And the reason for that was the need for speed and the fact that it was simply not practical for so many contracts to be coming to the Treasury. And indeed, I think in Chris Young's statement to the inquiry, my lady, he talks about some days there being as many as 11 contracts, an average of almost 4 a day. So in those early days, what emerged was it wasn't practical for individual contracts to come to the Treasury. And that is why the Quad and Number 10 decided to allocate a spending envelope to speed up those so that the bureaucracy didn't stop us securing those essential PPE contracts to save lives.
Thank you.
Mr. Bartley, you speak of a balance at paragraph 11 of your written evidence. The balance, it needed to be a balance between public spending principles, but also with the flexibility required to meet the urgent health response spending. Did you think at the time, and secondly, looking back now, do you think the right balance was struck in terms of public expenditure, the need for speed, the need for flexibility?
Well, I think first, if you look at the first envelope that was put in place for £100 million, that was in the context of the NHS having just 2 weeks of supply. And that is why there was such an urgency, because the imperative was to ensure we didn't run out of essential protective equipment for frontline services. And that is why the procurement process needed to be speeded up. Second, there was a huge global challenge with countries competing against each other. And third, the existing suppliers couldn't meet demand. So there's a requirement to go to new suppliers, most of whom were overseas, particularly in China. And there's also questions in China as to whether it had a further wave, as to whether that supply could be secured moving forward. And therefore, what characterized that early phase, which is addressed, I think, in the Treasury corporate statement, is the urgency of securing supply, and that in turn shaped the decision that the Prime Minister and the Quad took to set an envelope, which was what then as CST I was implementing.
Given that urgency, Mr. Barclay, the requirement to maintain value for money, to which you refer in paragraph 12 of your statement, and proper spending processes was extremely difficult, if not impossible, to maintain. Is that a fair characterisation of the position?
I think what characterised the position is that value for money changes at a time of national crisis. And so if I refer, Mr. Ward, to my private office's email on the 22nd of March, they say, and I quote, "CST feels deeply uncomfortable with this and doesn't feel like there's been the correct level of due diligence. However, CST feels he has been given no choice other than to approve." And that is because I accepted that with just 2 weeks of supply, then it was necessary at a time of national crisis to assess value for money differently to what would have been the case, if I refer back to your opening graph, when the original PPE budget had been set.
Well, I think, Mr. Barclay, the answer to my question is yes. One cannot apply the same principles to assessing value for money in an emergency where public procurement, say of PPE, is of vital importance, as one would normally, but one cannot even apply it in any meaningful sense. If one is told that the stocks are about to expire and that there is an urgent need to procure, it's simply not possible to know or to ascertain whether the price being paid is the going rate or is twice the going rate.
I'd respectfully say that the principles can be consistently applied in terms of value for money as a Treasury test. What I am suggesting, my lady, is the application of that principle changes, because what constitutes value for money is then different. So was I comfortable as a Chief Secretary that the government was paying 8 times or at some points 14 times the pre-pandemic price? Of course I wasn't. But did I respect that if the priority, which I agreed with, was to protect lives, then we needed to pay what the global market rate was at that time? And that is why the test for value for money, the principle would be applied, but the test would be different to what it would have been before the pandemic.
And how did you and others within the Treasury inform yourselves as to what the global market rate was at a given moment in time?
Well, that couldn't be for me to assess. That is why we had a delegated envelope in order that the accounting officer for the Department of Health could make that assessment, because again, consistent with managing public money before the pandemic, it is for the contracting parties, in this case the Department of Health, to make those assessments on the counterparties, the value for the money, and other conditions such as checking whether the stock is suitable. That is for the contracting parties, not the Treasury.
You were dependent, sorry, had you not finished your answer?
Well, I'm very happy.
You were dependent on the judgments made by the Department of Health and the DHSC when it came to understanding what the going rate was.
Yes.
Yeah. And I suppose that is what I meant when I said that an assessment of value for money couldn't have been conducted within the Treasury. It was conducted on the basis of say-so from others.
Well, my point is that is consistent with what would happen before a pandemic, where the accounting officer would have within their spending envelope the authority. What was different was the size of spend that was being allocated. So again, if I refer back to the email of the 23rd of March from David Williams, who was the accounting officer in Department of Health on this issue, he says he's satisfied with the purchase from a regulatory and proprietary perspective, and he's satisfied, quotes, that in the circumstances this purchase represents value for money. And that was consistent with the approach that is set out in managing public money.
Save that, if I may, Mr. Barclay, your deep discomfort and your frustration, we see that you experience sentiments such as these at various points in the correspondence, would in normal circumstances have been met with a greater explanation or the provision of greater detail in order to allay your concerns. In these situations, or in this situation, you really had to just go on the basis of what you were told by the DHSC.
Yes, I mean, I was often, and I think the correspondence, my lady, will show this, not least the times of emails, you know, bank holidays very late at night, weekends and so forth, with very, very quick turnarounds, was a reflection of the global competition with countries for contracts. The fact it was a supplier's market, the fact that they could demand terms in terms of upfront payments that would not normally be agreed to, and that both drove the spending envelope that was allocated to the Department of Health, but also shaped the value for money judgment they were reaching and communicating to us in the Treasury.
All right, I will come back to the emails. You've mentioned one of them. It's not the only one in which you express concern or discomfort. But before I do that, I just want to deal with the three phases that you identify in your written evidence. You describe them as the Treasury's approach shifting through three overlapping phases. Firstly, you identify a phase that runs from March to May of 2020, and you characterise it in this way. With an overriding priority on health outcomes, the Treasury supported emergency spending with a higher risk appetite due to the urgency of the situation, accepting trade-offs like higher costs for healthcare supplies, as the alternative could have been loss of life. And I think that's what you were referring to a few moments ago. That characterises that first phase, is that right? March till May 2020.
It does, and again, the fact that this was a cross-government decision led by the Quad can be seen from the fact that the Cabinet Office procurement policy, which was issued in March, expressly indicated a higher risk appetite, including instructions delegating payments in advance to accounting officers. So again, it wouldn't be normal outside of a crisis for such advance payments to be paid for supplies, but the Cabinet Office guidance allowed that because it reflected the urgency with 2 weeks of supply left, that all effort should be made, and the concern that other countries were going to outcompete us to secure those supplies.
Now, we've spoken about the information that was provided to you and the judgments that were provided to you by the DHSC. Was any other data available to the Treasury in making the judgments that informed phase one funding?
In terms of what other information, Mr. Ward, could you just clarify? Are you meaning on demand modelling or some of the?
Whatever it might be, what I'm interested to understand, and I'm going to come back to it towards the end of our exchanges on recommendations, is was there any reliable source of data that could inform what the spending envelope should be and what individual decisions on a particular contract should also be?
Well, I think it was very hard to know how much supply was going to be needed because there was huge uncertainty around the direction of the virus. There was gaps in data in terms of inventory. There was insufficient data, for example, from NHS colleagues on the burn rate. And so the procurement was done within the context of a highly uncertain environment. And as I alluded to earlier, Mr. Ward, it was uncertain to what extent suppliers such as from China could be relied on if, for example, the Chinese themselves had further waves of virus and needed more of their own supply. So those early decisions were taken in a very fluid and uncertain environment.
Let's move on to the second phase, if we may. That runs, according to your categorisation, from May 2020 until April 2021. Now, the initial period of that saw increasing costs. We know from the table that we saw that they continue to increase until June or July of 2020, the spending envelopes do. But you say that as the pandemic progressed and costs rose, the Treasury focused on delegating increasing budgets to the accounting officers as the initial emergency sign-off processes were not effective as a longer-term position, given the asymmetry of information between departments, in part DHSC and the Treasury. So to understand that, just as costs rose, the Treasury handed over to accounting officers the task of making those detailed decisions in given cases.
Well, I think the more material issue was the volume required exponentially rose, because as you will see with the delegation, the increased delegation on the envelope, that reflected an initial envelope for health needs specifically. There were then later questions which you may choose to come on to around when PPE was to cover reopening of the NHS, that creates demand. It was to provide PPE to other departments, such as prisons, that created further demand. There was then covering the devolved administrations and so forth. So the scope of what was being procured by DH was increasing, and that is why the envelope was expanded through the various phases.
And throughout these phases, or these, well, I'm talking about phase 2 as you describe it, but throughout this period, there is what you describe as an asymmetry of information between departments, including between the Treasury and DHSC.
Yes, because as I mentioned earlier, it is the contracting party that has the information on the counterparts. So they know what commercial conversations they're having with suppliers in China. They're liaising with our embassy network as part of that. But those aren't conversations that the Treasury is having. It is the contracting party, i.e. the department, that is having those conversations. And it is therefore the department that will have the data and that sort of detail.
Nothing in principle, though, to prevent the sharing of that data or the prevention of the siloing of data, is there? That data could be made available to more than one department. It could be made available. It could and should.
It could and should, and I think a flavour of my evidence has been the concern I had around the siloing of data.
Well, I said I'd leave to the end, but there's no reason not to address it now in terms of recommendations. What data changes would you recommend to prevent this asymmetry that you describe in your evidence?
I think it relates both to the Treasury and the Cabinet Office, and I think there were similar concerns from colleagues, Lord Agnew and others in the Cabinet Office. And I think bringing in external challenge, bringing in the commercial expertise in the Cabinet Office to help support the Department of Health, which had huge bandwidth challenges because of the volume of contracts they were trying to deal with, the huge pressures that they were under. If requests came to Treasury at a very late stage, that limited our ability to help influence those contracts and those decisions. And what I was pushing for as Chief Secretary was for earlier sight of that data so that we could then challenge it more effectively.
In the event of a future pandemic that called for emergency procurement, those measures should be put in place, should they not?
Well, I think the more we can break silos down, the better.
Let's move on to phase 3 then, a period that you identify as running from April 2021 to October 2022. And you say this: the Treasury built on previous learning, managing spending peaks more effectively with less acute trade-offs between taxpayer and patient interests, and preparing for a return to pre-COVID spending arrangements. Just want to unlock, if I may, with you, what you mean by building on previous learning. What, at this point, were the lessons that had already been learned from the experience of the previous months?
Well, I think first and foremost was around demand modelling. So one of the challenges, particularly early on, when many of the contracts were entered, was the uncertainty around demand modelling, what the path of the virus would be, what the burn rate would be on frontline services, the number of services that needed to be covered, the inventory data that they had, and I think the Department of Health colleagues found that challenging, and it took some time to put in place the demand modelling and the data around that. But by the third phase, obviously, that had significantly improved.
All right, thank you. You mentioned the devolved administrations a moment ago. I just want to pick up with you what was your role in ensuring that the devolved administration and the role of the Treasury had sufficient funding to cope with the challenges that they faced in terms of emergency procurement?
Yeah, so within the Treasury, I would be the lead minister in dealing with the devolved administration's finance ministers, so not their health ministers, but their finance ministers. And in terms of ensuring they had sufficient funding, firstly, that was applied consistently as it would before the pandemic in terms of Barnett consequential. So when additional money is allocated to England, an equivalent sum goes to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And then secondly, a number of the big ticket spending items, including PPE, were then allocated through the envelope on a UK-wide basis. And therefore we provided sufficient funding on advice with Department of Health colleagues as shaped by the Quad and the PM and the Chancellor's setting of the envelope in order to provide that on a UK-wide basis.
Any difference in treatment of the devolved administrations themselves, Scottish Government, Welsh Government, Northern Ireland Executive?
Not to my knowledge, Ms Ward.
Did they all have fiscal frameworks, for example?
In what regard?
You tell us that there was a fiscal framework in the Scottish Government allowing for borrowing up to £3 billion for capital and 1.75 billion for resource purposes. Similar arrangements in Wales, but not so in Northern Ireland.
That may be the case. I'd have to refresh, but there is bespoke legislation that applies to each of the DAs. What was in common was they were not under a duty to share data with the UK government in terms of their burn rate. So again, it pointed to some of the challenges both around the demand modelling, but also where they'd incurred cost in that initial phase by procuring themselves. There was a challenge in terms of how that was then allocated.
Can we infer from that answer that you would say that it would have been preferable, that it would be preferable in future, that sharing of data should take place?
Yes, a consistent theme of my time in government has been a push for one version of the truth across government and a sharing of data across silos.
All right. Mr. Bartley, you deal within your written evidence in some detail with a chronology of particular cases, demands for expenditure that you had to deal with that span from March 2020 all the way to September 2021. Yeah. So they span the 3 phases that you have identified. I don't propose to go through all of them with you. Instead, I want to take some early examples of the pressures that you were placed under in order to understand and extract any emerging themes from those. Let's start, if we may. You mentioned conditions being placed. I think it was in answer to a question from the chair. You placed conditions on the spending envelopes, did you not?
Yes.
Yeah. Let's have brought up onto the screen, if we may, INQ 000480114. Now, this is a letter from yourself, dated the 24th of April 2020, to Matt Hancock and Michael Gove. If we can start with page 1, para 1. Writing to you formally to confirm the funding envelopes agreed between the Treasury, Department of Health and Social Care for the procurement of ventilators, PPE and testing programmes. So that's the purpose of the letter. We then move down to paragraph 3, page 2 of 4. Sorry, it's yes, it is that half. As a result of this, the Treasury relied on the condition that DHSC accounting officer was content with those approvals to ensure due diligence and scrutiny was being applied appropriately. To support this, the Treasury approved the appointment of a second accounting officer who took on his new responsibilities from the 6th of March. Who was that? Do you recall?
It was David Williams.
Yeah. But what this letter makes very clear is that the accounting officer was effectively there making the judgments that would otherwise be made within the Treasury.
No, the accounting officer was making the normal decisions that an accounting officer would make in respect of their delegated envelope. The reason a second permanent secretary was put in was reflecting the intense pressure in terms of the sudden quantum shift in the volume of contracts that the Department of Health had to enter. So the Department of Health would normally, within their spending envelope, be the contracting party and their accounting officer responsible. What was happening was, because they needed to secure so much supply in a very globally challenged market and do so at such pace to save lives, because the critical issue driving the government's approach was to ensure we didn't run out of PPE, that was creating a massive pressure on the Department of Health, and that is why a second permanent secretary was appointed.
How many accounting officers were there?
In the Department of Health,
yes.
All departments at that point would have one perm sec. I think it's now much more common for departments to have two permanent secs, but from memory, although Treasury colleagues can clarify, I think it was the first time, other than in Treasury, that a department had a second permanent secretary. And again, it reflected the unique circumstances that we faced.
Let's just look at the conditions to which you've referred. This is paragraph 11 of this letter, page 3. There we are. These aim to ensure that we only enter into contracts with reputable companies who we can reasonably trust will fulfil contracts and provide safe equipment, and that public money is protected as far as possible in these challenging circumstances. The conditions were specifically designed to avoid slowing procurement down and have been agreed with your officials. They will, of course, be kept under review and adjusted as necessary. Could you summarise for us what the conditions were?
The conditions are set out in correspondence, but from memory, it was things like checking the quality of stock, because I was very concerned that we would procure stock that wasn't fit for purpose. It was a particular concern of mine because my career before coming into Parliament had been in financial crime prevention and as a lawyer at Barclays, and my sort of concern there was, if we paid for something at pace, do we have the ability to extract ourselves from that contract at a later point? There were conditions linked to the checks that would be done, and there's an interaction there with Foreign Office guidance through the First Secretary and so on. I think I can go to the bit of notes that I will have them in my notes, what the full conditions are, if that's helpful, Mr. Ward.
If it's easy to access, yes, please.
The conditions will have been set out in the delegation. In the delegation, when we went from 500, well, for the first £1 billion, that's where those would have been set out.
While you're looking for that, can I just ask for INQ 000534512 to be put up on the screen?
I don't know if Mr. Block or others could help. I don't know if anyone on your team can help, Mr. Block.
I think it's an annex.
Right. Okay, well, I don't really want to take up too much time. Thank you, Mr. Block. Sorry to interrupt.
We'll come back to it. Mr. Barclay, I just wanted to invite, you mentioned Lord Agnew earlier. Have you seen this, this email in which he expresses concern that he was being asked to agree a sum as large as £1.25 billion in the course of a single day?
Yes.
Yeah. Was that exceptional? You spoke about large sums needing to be authorised in short periods of time.
It wasn't as exceptional as it should have been. And it was as I think the evidence shows, in my comments through my private office, there were repeated instances where we were asked for very large spending decisions with very, very little time. And on occasion, that was escalated through number 10, even before the Treasury had received the request.
It's the reason you had deep discomfort or deep concerns, isn't it?
Yes.
Because those principles, the principles that you applied when you were working at Barclays and that you were used to, simply couldn't, in practical terms, be meaningfully applied.
Well, the concern I was raising was around the data sharing and the transparency, because we were reliant on the accounting officer. That was consistent with the framework of managing public money. The concern I had was the quantums were of a very different order to what would be the case in peacetime. And whilst I agreed that the imperative was to save lives, and that is why the Prime Minister and the Quad had decided to have such big envelopes devolved, I felt equally that required a transparency of data around that. And indeed, that is why in that letter that you brought up a moment ago, Mr. Ward, at the end you'll see one of the things I'd insisted on was that was shared with the Controller and Auditor General. Because I spent 4 years on the Public Accounts Committee when I first entered Parliament, and I felt that it was important that the National Audit Office was notified in real time that we were delegating such large envelopes. So the logic for delegating, I thought, was very understandable, but I thought that should be communicated to the National Audit Office because it was such an exceptional amount that was being delegated.
In effect, in the interest of transparency?
Indeed.
Yeah. And did you frequently take that step?
I took it on a number of occasions. So I think in both when I refused the Department of Health's request to retrospectively agree spend, which we may come on to in the second phase in January 2021, which forced the Department of Health accounts to be irregular and therefore notifiable by the NAO. I think we had 2 letters to him the previous April. You brought one up, but I was very surprised when the day after that letter was sent, I then got a request to increase the envelope further by a further 3 billion from the Department of Health, particularly given that the Department of Health knew about the letter when I sent it. And therefore, I requested that a second letter to be sent to the Controller and Auditor General, making clear that it had then shifted from 1 billion to 4 billion. I also raised with Treasury colleagues whether we should write to the Chair of the Public Accounts Committee, but on advice, it was decided not to do so. So I hope one can see, Mr. Ward, that there was a consistent pattern on my part of recognising the imperative of the remarkable times we faced and the need to save lives, with a desire to have transparency around those decisions, including notifying the National Audit Office in real time that we were delegating such large sums.
I wasn't going to take you as far as January 2021, but thank you for that evidence. I would like to take you to another example within March 2020. This is the Mexico offer from a Chinese provider that you may recall. Could we have displayed INQ 000572 255 and page 1 of it?
I think Treasury team may have come up with the goods.
To Mr. Ward, please.
Okay.
It's the list of conditions.
Yes. I see. Let's deal with that now then before we get into Mexico. I've been given an INQ number. It's an email. Perhaps it's the annex to which reference has been made. It's INQ 000273 559. And it is around this time. I gather it's the 25th of March. Here we are. Second paragraph. Conditions for the delegated funding envelopes are that you must. Is this what you were looking for?
Yes, I think, I don't know if this is on PPE or ventilators, because the paragraph above says ventilators, but a lot of the conditions were consistent across the piece. So how legitimate are the companies with which we're contracting? The certification of the equipment, because I was very concerned that because of the pressure of speed, PPE might be bought, that then, if it proved unsafe, our frontline services would be placing a reliance on it, which I was very worried that in the haste of procuring it, we didn't want to give false comfort by providing frontline staff with PPE that wasn't fit for purpose. And so I was signalling that that was a particular risk that I was concerned about. And then we were recognising that because of the unique global market, there was a premium, but trying to bring some transparency to where the price was spiking above 25%. So again, not making it unduly bureaucratic, but trying to get some transparency around any outliers on the decision, ensuring that there was the right governance process there, using the local knowledge of our embassy team, and then pushing on demand management as well, and trying to avoid upfront payments, but recognising that the reality of the market, and because it was a supplier's market, many suppliers were able to demand significant upfront payments as the price of contracting and securing those supplies.
All right, thank you, Mr. Barclay, and thank you to Mr. Block and others for the speedy retrieval of that reference. Can I now take you to the reference that I was about to go to, INQ 000572 255. This is dated the 22nd of March of 2020 from your private secretary. It relates to an offer from a Chinese provider called Mexico, you may recall.
Yes. I think this was part of a wider, I think they were asking for 100 million, of which there was a 20 million specific contract, but it was part of the initial 100 million envelope that was allocated by the Quad to.
I just want to draw your attention to this bullet. It's about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 down. The team continue to have value for money and propriety concerns with this purchase, although these are lower than discussed yesterday, given it appears that Mexico is at least a legitimate company. However, the team is still concerned that the equipment may not work. No contract has yet been seen, and payment in advance of receipt is inherently risky. Compared to the multiple asks we've signed off over the last week, this therefore carries by far the most risk from propriety, regularity, and value for money perspectives. That was not unusual, those concerns, in relation to particular offers, was it?
Well, I would put it in the context of the first line, the UK currently has 2-week supply.
Yeah.
And the advice from my Director General, Cat Little, was, quote, "I don't see how we can do anything else but approve this given the timescales. I would be keen to move to a delegated model as soon as possible." So, again, it wasn't that there wasn't an awareness either in the Treasury or, I am sure, for health colleagues to speak to, but I'm sure they were also aware. But the reality was, with 2 weeks supply, the priority was to secure that supply for the front line.
Are you suggesting that had the supply been 2 months, a different approach might have been taken?
Well, there would be less urgency, yes.
Less urgency, and therefore that value for money balance would have been struck differently.
Correct.
All right. Let's move on a couple of days. 24th of March and INQ 000572260. This is in relation to approval that was sought by DHSC to pre-order 12.5 million testing kits for £75 million, which you may recall.
Yep.
You were recommended to approve the order, given the government's current objective to rapidly expand testing, and you did do so the same day. Yes?
Yes.
You requested a detailed breakdown from DHSC on what demand modelling showed we would need against the supply curve of what equipment and staffing would be in place. And we see that the Treasury was saying push DHSC hard on absence of detailed breakdown. Was the DHSC pushed hard, and if so, what came of it?
Well, what the he is myself. So I was requesting that alongside these significant spend decisions, we needed to have clearer modelling data. And indeed, a moment ago, we touched on the conditions. One of the conditions I set specifically, I think, to this order was, quote, "a clear plan for managing excess stock," is either this order or another. It may have been a PPE one on that same day. But on the 24th, that was one of the conditions I set. So throughout, we were pushing for better demand modelling. But to be fair to health colleagues, it was hard for them to provide that data at that stage because there was such uncertainty over the path of the virus. There was uncertainty over the levels of usage within the NHS because that data on inventory and burn rate was not available. And so the spending decisions were having to be taken without that information. And one of the things I was pushing for was to try and ensure that moving forward, we would get that information for future decisions.
And that's reflected in a further email. If we could just have up on the screen INQ 000572257, page 1 and the first bullet point. There we are, the table highlighted below, setting out levels of supply before and after Treasury approval, wants to show Munira how low DHSC let supplies go before coming to us for information and how little information DHSC has been giving us. I know you're already working on this. Can I check in on how long this will take to produce so I can manage expectation? Now, you said a moment ago, to be fair to DHSC, there were all manner of challenges that they faced in providing that information. Were they, in essence, requests for information that it would have been possible to accede to?
Well, the Munira call relates to a slightly different but related point. So what happened there was...
This is Munira Mirza?
Yes, who is was one of the Prime Minister's key aides. And Number 10 had had a complaint that critical orders were being slowed down by Treasury because we were asking questions on value for money and due diligence. Specifically on the 24th of March 2020, it emerged that that suggestion was erroneous and the request had not actually been made to Treasury. But I think what it does is point to the significant pressure that Treasury officials were under to expedite orders, which in turn then placed me under pressure to expedite orders because we were being called by number 10 for not clearing quickly enough an order that we had not actually even received.
I think I want to move on now from the chronology, because even in that limited time frame, we are seeing a number of themes emerge, or a number of systemic problems, which is that the Treasury is extremely reliant on what it is told by the Department of Health. It is not able to perform the usual checks that it would perform in normal times. And really the only measure that you were scrupulous to undertake was to maintain high levels of transparency so that after the event it could be seen what was spent on what. Is that a fair summary?
Well, firstly, I wasn't doing this after the event, so I was notifying the National Audit Office in real time. So I first notified them when the envelope went to 1 billion. It subsequently, my lady, went to over 13 billion within England and 15 billion in UK-wide. So I wouldn't accept.
I wasn't suggesting, just to be clear, I wasn't suggesting, Mr. Barclay, that you were acting after the event. I was suggesting that your transparency, your concern to maintain high levels of transparency, were designed to enable those that wished to, after the event, to explore what decisions were made in relation to public expenditure.
In part, one of the key things I was pushing for was around the governance. How did we bring in the commercial expertise within the Cabinet Office to inform some of those contract negotiations around things like termination provisions? What was the right sort of wider governance, so particularly over the summer, in terms of the wider cross-departmental governance that was put in place over PPE. So again, it wasn't simply within the Department of Health silo. So I was pushing to try and put in more governance, more conditions, recognising at the same time that the Prime Minister and the Quad had decided on the envelopes, and the envelopes were necessary given it was a global market, other countries were willing to pay, the supply wasn't secure from China because we didn't know what would happen with the path of the virus. And of course, we didn't know other factors. We didn't know how quickly a vaccine would come on stream. We didn't know if there'd be further waves. So some of the PPE stock may have been more required had, for example, the vaccine not been delivered at an earlier stage. So it was a very, very uncertain environment into which I was, one, recognising the paramount priority of the government was to secure supply for frontline services, but at the second, that alongside that, we should put in as much governance and transparency as possible. And I was concerned, as I think the evidence shows repeatedly, around the lack of data sharing across government.
Well, just before you carry on, Mr. Ward, in the middle of Mr. Ward's question was an assertion that there were systemic problems, and I wanted to get your take on whether you accept there were systemic problems. This point about having to rely on the DHSC. Or is it just inevitable because of the circumstances?
Well, I think it's inevitable, my lady, that the contracting parties will have the information. I don't think it is inevitable that if the department is aware of information some weeks before, that is communicated to me as Chief Secretary the night before the contract must be signed. And we may come on to, but examples like that. And what I was frequently pushing for is, when did the department first know of this, and why has the request come to me at a point where, if I don't agree, then the consequence is we lose critical supplies, which would put frontline services at risk. And that is what Cat Little's email is referring to with the 2 weeks supply. But we may come on to with some other contracts, and you mentioned earlier Lord Agnew's email where he talks of 1.5 billion and 24 hours to decide. It was that late notification that was a source of frustration to me as CST.
Thank you.
Did you feel that the notification that you received was later than it had to be?
Yes.
Yeah, on numerous occasions?
Yes.
And if you're able to offer a view, why did that happen? Why were you not notified at a time sufficiently early to enable you to meaningfully respond to it, scrutinise, question, and do what one would expect a person in your role would do within the Treasury?
Well, I think that's probably more for health colleagues to explain. I think it's fair to say they were under huge pressure and extremely busy and dealing with many things. But at the same time, I think if the request comes late to Treasury, then obviously the ability to challenge that is curtailed.
And when you say late, we've looked at an example where stock was down to only 2 weeks remaining. That is a request that comes into Treasury late by reference to the available stock. Is that what you were referring to just now? Or did you mean a request that related to an offer that might be lost within 24 hours?
So there's one. So I think that initial period in March was so early in the pandemic that actually the pressure on health was more because of the huge upturn in requirement, and therefore potentially more understandable. What I'm alluded to is, for example, I think there was a £300 million contract from memory that came to me the night before where the company lost its option if it didn't exercise it the next day. That was on domestic manufacture. And I was very surprised that there hadn't been detailed discussions with that counterparty before notifying me the night before the option expired. I was equally surprised when the request to increase the delegation from 1 to 4 billion came the day after my letter to the National Audit Office was sent. And it struck me as surprising that hadn't come to me sooner.
So in essence, had you had a bit more time, you would have imposed more scrutiny over offers that were incoming?
Well, I think it's not just that the Treasury would have been able to have an officials more time to scrutinise that, but also Cabinet Office colleagues who had specific commercial expertise would have had more time to be involved in those decisions.
And with that additional time and that additional scrutiny, whether it came from Cabinet Office or from Treasury, would have come a better prospect of achieving value for money. Is that fair?
I think the contracts would have been better. I think the challenge on demand modelling needs to be viewed within the context that most of the contractual spend was committed by early June, I think, from memory, certainly April, May, and by June, most of that contractual spend was committed. And I think the demand modelling didn't really start to come through in better form until the autumn. So whilst I was pressing for that to come sooner, and believe it ideally should have come sooner, it probably wouldn't have come soon enough to have shaped many of those orders in April and May.
All right. You mentioned that some of your colleagues in the Department for Health or the DHSC would be able to provide more detail on the reasons for that time lag, if it was a time lag. And we've heard from some DHSC witnesses and we're yet to hear from others. I will take you to a part of Mr. Chris Young's witness evidence in a moment. He, of course, was the Director of Finance at the DHSC. But before doing so, could I just invite you to comment on any other themes, any other emerging themes from the matters that you chronicle, you put in chronological order in your witness evidence that we've not touched on. We've looked at data inefficiencies, timing, the reliance that had to be placed on what the Treasury was told by the DHSC. Are there other emerging themes as you look back and consider those events that you set out in your witness evidence?
For me, throughout data was the key, both data sharing but also data modelling, and that was sort of a paramount issue. I think the ability to scale was a challenge. So by the time DH and Cabinet colleagues had put in place domestic manufacture to be able to scale that, the global price by then had started to fall dramatically. So we had missed the key period where most of the contractual spend had been incurred.
How might that have been addressed?
So I think, as part of lessons learned, I think that we were incredibly reliant on overseas supplies, predominantly from China, and I think that drove a lot of the early procurement concerns in terms of reliability. So our ability to scale, there was very little domestic supply, and there's very little data at the start of the pandemic. And if you look at when the significant spend was incurred, it was in those first few months on PPE, and that was the critical period, that early phases where most of the contractual spend was incurred. And at that point, there wasn't the demand modelling, there wasn't the ability to scale domestic manufacturer, and that in turn then drove the reliance on overseas.
We weren't properly prepared.
Well, my lady, we may come on to that, but if you look as an example at the Franklin Moselin decision, which actually as Health Secretary on advice from Lord Patrick Carter, I took the reluctant decision. I wanted to find a purpose for it, having spent so much money on it. But the commercial reality was actually the value for money decision on Lord Carter's very good advice was not to continue that. And that is because keeping stock, warehousing stock going out of date, the amount of stock you would need for a pandemic of this size comes at a significant cost. And so for me, it was the ability to scale that was the more critical issue, rather than whether we had lots of PPE stock for something of a scale that would have come at a very big price to hold.
That's what I meant by lack of preparedness. Not just the size of stockpile, but the ability to scale up.
Milena, I think the key for me is the ability to scale rather than having lots of stock ready for a pandemic, because that would go out of date and be expensive to store.
And when you say the ability to scale, do you mean onshoring, an independent manufacturing capability?
So I think there's an interesting question around within NHS tendering and procurement contracts, how one scores the value of resilience versus the best price, not least looking to the fact we have a spending review coming up and there will be pressure on department spends. But the reality was at the start of the pandemic, there was very little domestic manufacture. Linked to that also, I think there is work that can be done, and the Permanent Secretary of the Department of International Trade did some work on this, looking at what are the critical raw materials and other elements that one needs as part of that supply.
We may have moved out of your role as CST with that question, but I'm conscious that you've had...
Blame me.
Excuse me?
Blame me.
Well, I was just conscious that you've had a wealth of experience in other departments. So no harm, I doubt, in having your view on that. We've also touched on lessons learned. Can I just take you, as I said I would, to part of Chris Young's evidence? It's INQ 000563 070. And he touches on a number of issues here, including that one about the requests that were made of DHSC effectively for information that couldn't be provided. He says this: finally, I felt that despite the best efforts or best attempts of all civil servants to find common ground, the risk appetite of the Treasury ministers was not always aligned with the risk appetite of the Prime Minister and DHSC ministers in respect to the procurement of PPE, particularly at the outset of the pandemic, where, as I've set out, the need for rapid assurance and decision-making was paramount. Treasury ministers were asking for information that was not necessarily available at a frequency that distracted people from the immediate priority of the Prime Minister and DHSC ministers of securing PPE, which risked necessary spending being deemed irregular by Treasury ministers. Do you think that's fair comment?
No. And let me explain why. I think, firstly, as he says there was a frequency in those first few weeks, which is why we moved to the delegated model. And indeed, that was the case that Department of Health made to the Prime Minister and the Quad, and why the initial £100 million, which went to 500, that then went to £1 billion, that then went to 4 billion, that went to 9 billion, that went to 6 billion pounds. That is exactly why the envelope was put in place. I think to go to a spending envelope of over £13 billion just within England, and I would draw your attention, Mr. Ward, to SUPS at the end of the year, where there was over 55 billion of additional health spend. I think that is a stretch to suggest that Treasury colleagues and indeed Treasury ministers who, when there's over 55 billion of additional spend and the envelope goes within a matter of 2 months to over £13 billion, are not reflecting the risk appetite of the Prime Minister and the Chancellor. But I think at the same time, it is proper for Treasury ministers to be asking questions of value for money, but in a way that doesn't impede those supplies getting to the front line. And if one looks at the evidence submitted to the inquiry, one will see repeated instances where I reluctantly agree to spend because I don't want to see a contract lost because of its impact on the front line, but I flag concerns with that and the importance of conditions to try and better protect value for money within that spend.
There's a balance to be struck, isn't there?
Of course.
And I think what Mr. Young, is suggesting here that there were times when that balance was struck wrongly, so that what was intended as a legitimate request for detail became a distraction. You would disagree with that?
I would, and it was an argument that Department of Health ran with Number 10 on a number of occasions, which I've alluded to the example with Manura. There's an example in the notes with the Chief Executive of the UK Health Security Agency. And I'm very keen to put on record that the Treasury officials worked remarkably hard and long hours, to the point that one of my senior officials, I was so concerned at the amount of work she was doing, I spoke twice to the Permanent Secretary to ensure we were supporting. And that reflected the massive amount of work we were doing to respond to health in a timely fashion. So the suggestion that the Treasury officials or ministers were not responding in a timely fashion is not one I accept.
Thank you, Mr. Barclay. My lady, I'm on my final topic, which is lessons learned.
The trouble is we're running out of time, Mr. Ward, and we have another 25 minutes of CP questions, and we have another witness, and another 20 minutes of CP questions for that witness too.
Right. Well, Mr. Barclay, you've given your reflections, I think, on lessons learned. Is there anything you wish to add to them? And then I will sit down.
I will take my cue from my lady and be succinct. So no.
So no. All right.
If anything does occur to you and you want to submit them in writing, be really grateful. Obviously, always ready to receive any thoughts, especially from someone who's been in your position. Are you in any problems? We take a break for the stenographer. I'll reduce it to 10 minutes because we're so short of time. Are you okay if we just take the break now?
Of course.
Come back. You sure?
You're good.
Very well. I shall return at 3:10. Mr. Wilcock.
Mr. Barclay, I've been encouraged to be as quick as I can with you, and I'm sure you'd appreciate that as well. I'm asking you questions on behalf of two core participants. One is the UK COVID bereaved Families for Justice, and the second is the Northern Ireland COVID bereaved Families for Justice. Can I start out by asking you what might be called UK-wide questions? You looked at a letter that you wrote with Mr. Wald just after you started giving evidence, where you explained why conditions had been put on funding envelopes in order to ensure that contracts were only entered into what you termed reputable companies. Do you remember looking at that letter?
Yes, I do.
And the phrase was reputable companies who we can reasonably trust will fulfil these contracts and provide safe equipment, and that public money is protected as far as possible in these challenging circumstances, which I think we all understand. Do you agree that in deciding whether a company was reputable, you would have expected attention to be paid, whether by the accounting officer or anyone else involved, to factors such as whether that company had only recently been established or had no prior involvement in PPE supply?
Yes.
Would it also have been relevant to consider the extent of company funds or historical turnover?
Yes.
And what about the fact that the company had been introduced by an intermediary who stood to make a significant profit from any contract with the company involved? Would that have been a red flag as to whether the company was reputable or not?
Well, I think all three things are relevant. All issues relating to a contracting party are relevant to the department that is contracting with them.
Do you agree that sadly a number of companies that the government DHSC contracted with might be thought to have raised at least one of those red flags?
Well, that would be for the contracting party, but I think so in terms of what red flags there were, then those would be issues that would be looked at through the normal process by the accounting officer and the contracting party.
I'm going to move on to a different topic and ask you to look at another document. Can we have INQ 000109535 on screen, please? And we'll see that this is a letter that you sent to Matt Hancock on the 16th of July 2020. And once it's on screen, if we can go to paragraph 2, you will see, I hope, that you wrote that it was disappointing to hear that the police, LA, local authorities, I assume some parts of the NHS and prisons, have all incurred costs buying their own PPE. With her lady's leave, I'll come back to the passage about the devolved administrations later on. And you ended by saying, furthermore, these organisations have been buying from the wholesale market at inflated prices, which DHSC has been supplying at cost price. Now, many of the people I represent view this situation as wholly inappropriate and tantamount to profiteering by commercial wholesalers at a time when PPE was significantly constrained. Do you agree that purchasing items the DHSC had been providing at cost price at the inflated prices that the emergency had created amounted to such profiteering?
Well, firstly, I think there were, in the early phase, challenges that were experienced by the Department of Health in terms of their distribution. That is why the PPE portal was set up. But again, that was starting from a zero base to set that up. And so there were challenges on distribution. The reason for my letter to the Health Secretary was because I was concerned about the value for money of delegated funds allocated by the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, then being used to supply wholesalers who then sold to other public bodies. So that was done initially, my understanding, by health colleagues because of the distribution challenge, but I was very keen to see that curtailed because I didn't regard it as value for money.
Do you regard it as profiteering?
By whom?
By the people using the emergency to buy items, sell items at inflated prices?
Well, I don't think that the Department of Health should be providing to wholesalers if the portal could be put in place in order that they could then distribute that directly, and that was the issue that I was pressing on.
Thank you. Now, the letter goes on to refer to forceful requests from local governments, other government departments, GPs and pharmacies to reimburse PPE costs that they have legitimately incurred because supply from DHSC was not available. Can you tell us whether that actually happened? Were they reimbursed?
Yes, and I think as the notes submitted to the inquiry showed, I had a meeting with the devolved administration finance ministers. The minutes of that meeting have a series of comments from those finance ministers reflecting on the constructive nature of that engagement. Part of that engagement was then raising concerns.
We'll come on to devolved administration in a minute. The minute I'm asking you just about the local government department.
Well, the same issue applied to both, which was my concern from a value for money point of view that we were not double funding, that we were not funding bodies to procure PPE directly, and also funding the Department of Health through the very quickly expanded envelope that had gone up to over £13 billion, which had been provided on the basis that they were funding public bodies. So firstly, my concern was we didn't want to be paying twice. And secondly, I was concerned about the inefficiency, because part of the reason for having the larger envelope with the Department of Health was so that they could use our embassy network, they could use economies of scale, and if individual public bodies were then contracting, the risk was they were contracting at less advantageous terms compared to the wider UK fund.
Mr. Barclay, we understand you wanting to say what you want to say, but if you answer just the question, we will definitely not fall out with my lady and go over the 20 minutes. Was any assessment undertaken of the additional cost to the public purse of the necessary reimbursement, i.e. the difference between the receipts from DHSC sales at cost versus the commercial price paid by what we might call community providers?
My recollection is that the Health Secretary wrote to me in September following my letter and subsequent work that the Department of Health had done to ensure that the envelope was then allocated to the respective bodies.
But what was the additional cost? How much did the envelope have to be increased by?
The funding for the envelope was already there. The funding for the envelope on the 2nd of June had gone to the 13 billion level. So the envelope was there, hence the need for health to reconcile that with the individual bodies.
And can you say what the amount of that reconciliation involved?
I can't offhand, but that would have been a discussion that the Department of Health would have had with the prison service, with local authorities, with the police. So the quantum will vary depending on
It's
the
a matter
entity
of detail.
concerned.
I think we can understand why you might not be able to tell us immediately. Can I move on to my second set of questions? And they're about how the devolved administrations fitted in to the UK-wide procurement approach. We heard evidence on Monday from Mr. Manley, who was then the Director General of the COVID-19 at the Foreign Office between March and September 2020. And he told us that on the 16th of April, the Permanent Secretary of DHSC wrote the devolved administrations to stress that they were going to be trying to insist upon a kind of all-UK procurement approach. And I'd like in that context for you to look at INQ 000336538, please. And while that's coming up, I hope we'll see that this is a letter from the Ministers of Finance for the Devolved Nations, dated the 12th of May, to express, quote, their collective concerns in regards to the limited supply of PPE currently being delivered through the proposed UK-wide procurement approach. This has resulted, the letter goes on to say, in the devolved governments incurring significant costs to secure sufficient PPE to protect our frontline workers. And then in the third paragraph, the devolved, the ministers state that, quote, the DHSC cannot currently guarantee the UK government-led PPE procurement can meet the needs of the devolved administrations. Were you aware at that stage that the DHSC was unable to guarantee adequate PPE supply to the devolved administrations?
Well, yes, that had been discussed with the finance ministers in the meeting I alluded to a moment ago. It is why the Four Nations Protocol was being put in place. It is why I wrote to the Health Secretary in terms of encouraging him to address this. But again, it reflected, as in the earlier exchanges with Mr. Ward, the fact that this was in May, at the early phase of the pandemic, when things were being worked at huge pace. Distribution was a challenge, not just with the devolved administrations, but as per your earlier questions, with local bodies such as the police and local authorities. And it also reflected a challenge in that the devolved administrations were not under a duty to share their data with the UK government, so their burn rate on how much PPE they were using, they were not required to share with the UK government. And to some extent, perhaps not surprisingly, they wanted the best of both worlds to be able to procure independently whilst also having access to the UK-wide procurement pot. So those were natural early challenges as we rapidly scaled up in those first few weeks. But what I hope my letter to the Health Secretary and my exchanges with the Finance Ministers showed was how we approached that in a very constructive spirit from a UK Treasury point of view with Finance Minister counterparts in order to address that. And the subsequent letter from the Health Secretary in September shows that that work was done.
And so there's no misunderstanding. Can we go back to the letter that you looked at with Mr. Wald, INQ 000109535, and go to the passage I summarised, where you wrote, you were also disappointed that devolved administrations are now seeking additional funding for existing purchases via the Barnett formula. Is that part of the exchanges you've just been telling us about?
Yes, so there's two issues. The UK-wide fund was to cover PPE, but there was a concern that the devolved administrations in that early phase of the pandemic had themselves unilaterally procured PPE, and therefore there was a question as to whether that was paid through the UK-wide fund or whether funding was allocated to England only through the Department of Health and then subject to Barnett consequentials that would have then applied to the Scotland administration.
So many people in Northern Ireland in particular would like to know, were you told at the time that you agreed the UK-wide funding approach, the first envelope, that perhaps the DHSC might be unable to guarantee devolved administration supply? Were you aware at that stage?
Well, the Department of Health was moving at huge pace to secure supply. The issue from a Treasury perspective was, had we provided sufficient funds to enable them to do so? And I think the quantum that had been delegated shows that we had provided sufficient funds.
Did you think you had provided sufficient quantum?
We had provided, by the 2nd of June, we had provided over 15 billion on a UK-wide basis.
And you thought that was sufficient?
Yes.
Finally, can we please have INQ 000377395 on screen? And this might have been part of the correspondence you told us about earlier, but it's an email actually dated the 15th of May 2020 between various officials within the Welsh, Northern Irish and Scottish governments about how they should respond to a letter from the DHSC looking for their views on the proposed Four Nations approach, where DHSC would manage a PPE fund on behalf of all Four Nations on the basis that the Treasury believed that that was the most efficient way to procure PPE. That's the background to the correspondence. But if we go to the last paragraph, we can see that the officials involved suggested that a better way than the one that was being suggested to manage the proposed sensible Four Nations approach would be, and I quote, to form a new Four Nations PPE procurement group, to plan expenditure where each administration would be an equal partner, and its remit would be to plan future PPE expenditure. Where the PPE requirement of each nation overlap, this group could secure better value contracts. Where policy approaches have diverged, it would enable each nation to put in place local solutions, either unilaterally or with one or more of the other nations. Were you aware of that proposal?
Well, indeed, we had a meeting, so just looking at my notes, with the Devolved Administration Finance Ministers on the 19th of May, where in response, I obviously haven't seen the email that has been put up, which I presume was a...
Oh, well, you should have done it. It was meant to be given to your team.
Okay, well, in which case the error will be with me, not anyone else. But in terms of that, if I look at the date, it's the 15th of May.
Correct.
If I look at the minutes of the meeting on the following Tuesday, the 19th of May, the quotes show that the Finance Minister for Wales saying that the subsequent paper coming out of the exchange with officials, the paper was really helpful in recognising some of the challenges faced. the Finance Minister for Scotland. This paper is very helpful in setting out potential options, next steps. In my remarks in the meeting, these are unprecedented times, and unfortunately we are going to have to live with some uncertainty during it. There is no magic bullet to these issues given the crisis. Finance Minister for Scotland, this would be really valuable, especially work to focus on outcomes. And indeed, that reflects an earlier letter on the 12th of May from the Finance Minister of Scotland, which pointed out all countries, quotes, all countries are chasing the same supply chains, which has become a seller's market. DHSC's proposal for a four-nations approach which delivers the PPE we require to meet our needs, providing some flexibility to enable our procurement if it doesn't. Respecting the concerns you expressed last week that these costs are not double funded, etc. So I think the challenges we're talking about, again, mid-May, a very early phase of this. The challenges were collective. The finance ministers were working very constructively together. And I would suggest that the minutes of the 19th May meeting shows that the UK Treasury was engaging very constructively with the finance ministers and very much engaging with the concerns raised.
Are you able to tell us whether or not what resulted in terms of the two possibilities?
I think there will be a letter from me, a letter from Matt Hancock to me, dated 28th of September. I appreciate the difficulties this situation has caused for non-NHS public services. Some departments working with other departments to reimburse them for the cost of clinical grade PPE they have purchased. And then he went on, I think he went on to address the DAs in that letter. But the substance of the letter was that there had been work over the summer to address the funding challenge that the DAs were facing through the UK-wide funding.
Okay, thank you very much. My lady, we have been given permission for other questions, but in the circumstances, I'm not going to ask them now, but we may seek to raise them in written
Of course,
later.
and if there's anything more you require in writing, Mr Wilcox,
we
I'm
can
really
do that as well.
to you.
Thank you.
Mr Thomas.
Good afternoon, Mr Barclay. My name's Leslie Thomas and I'm representing the Federation of Ethnic Minority Healthcare Workers. I will be brief in relation to the questions that I've asked you. I don't think you've been asked about these issues yet. Firstly, help us with this. What systems did you utilise to ensure that the Treasury's COVID procurement adhered to public law principles of transparency, equality and fairness in the use of emergency contracts and direct awards?
Well, firstly, we applied managing public money, and as you will see from the records, I specifically sought advice from officials in April 2020, whether delegation of £1 billion, the initial sort of significant delegation within the spending envelope, was consistent with managing public money, and indeed asked if it was consistent with the ministerial code, and I was confirmed by officials to the affirmative that it was. Secondly, as I alluded to earlier in evidence, at repeated points I ensured there was transparency in communication to the National Audit Office and to the CNAG to ensure that that was done. And third, we worked with other government departments to ensure that there was wider government scrutiny, including external scrutiny, and indeed, for example, the Ernst & Young report that confirmed, I think it was early June, but there was an Ernst & Young report at quite an early stage, again confirming the challenges of supply and endorsing that the government's approach was the right one.
Thank you. Your statement at paragraph 25, that's INQ 0005748180. We don't need to call it up, but I think you've got your statement there. You mentioned that the usual procedures were altered for expediency with senior officials overseeing these decisions. My question is this: how did the Treasury ensure that the public sector equality duty was upheld during these changes, and were the equality impact assessments, EIAs, conducted before making procurement decisions affecting frontline healthcare workers? To put it in a nub, Shell, do you believe that the public sector equality duty played a substantive role in shaping equitable procurement practices as opposed to just being a tick box exercise?
Well, I would argue ensuring sufficient finance was in place to protect supply to frontline services was essential to meeting any such duty. Not least because within the NHS, often those communities most at risk were those most reliant on ensuring that we maintained PPE supplies. So I think, firstly, securing supply was essential, and that is what the Treasury did. Secondly, on the specific point of the delegation, from memory, I think that was to small sums of quantum of around £10 million, but it reflected to the point earlier with Chris Young's evidence, which was in that early phase of the pandemic, there were so many contracts, it was necessary to reflect the urgency and the speed and have more flexible arrangements in place, and that is why the delegation was granted.
But sorry, you haven't answered my question, because part of my question was, during these changes, and I fully appreciate that you needed to act with expediency, get that, it was a pandemic. My question was, how did you ensure that the public sector equality duty and, so for example, equality impact assessments were conducted properly? How was this overseen?
Well, that would be for the contracting party to do that, which would be the Department of Health. But again, I think there was a recognition that there was a huge urgency around the contracts, but it would be for health colleagues to address.
Urgency doesn't mean that the public sector equality duty is thrown out, though, does it?
No, but as I say, it would be for the contracting party to answer how they met that duty. But if I was pushed, milady, I would suggest that ensuring that there was sufficient supply of PPE to frontline services was consistent with that duty, not against it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thomas. I'm sorry. We've got another witness waiting in the wings. Really sorry. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Barker. I'm sorry if it seems a bit rushed. Sometimes timetabling witnesses works perfectly, and other times not so perfectly. And I'm afraid we have one of your former colleagues waiting in the wings to give evidence. So thank you very much indeed for your help to the inquiry. I appreciate how busy you must be, so really grateful too. And as I say, if anything does occur to you, please write in and we'll bear it very much in mind.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Ward.
My lady, our next witness this afternoon is Lord Feldman, who I see is just taking up position.
I'm sorry you've had to wait. I think you have to think back to your days as a practising barrister, Lord Feldman, to remember that timetabling witnesses doesn't always work.
No, it's pretty good though. Pretty tight.
Yes, if the witness could be sworn or affirmed, please.
Yes, of course, yeah. I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Mr. Ward.
Thank you, my lady. Please state your full name for the inquiry.
Yes, Andrew Simon Feldman.
Thank you. And Lord Feldman, thank you also for providing to the inquiry a witness statement. It's INQ 000540486, which you have signed. Will you please confirm that it is true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
Yes. Lord Feldman, by way of background, I don't think we'll go quite far as back as your time at the bar, but your current role, you are CEO of Teneo's UK Strategy and Communications business, a PR and advisory company, is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
And you were previously managing partner of Tulcan Communications until it was acquired by Teneo.
That's correct.
Yeah. You are also director of Andrew Feldman Associates.
Yes, that's correct.
What does Andrew Feldman Associates do?
It's just a business where all of my non-Teneo interests, so if non-exec directorships, philanthropic stuff, is managed through that.
Thank you. Let's move to the period in which we are focused for the purpose of this inquiry and this module of this inquiry, between the 23rd of March 2020 and the 15th of May of 2020, you served as an unpaid volunteer, assisting in the challenge of emergency procurement.
Yes, that's correct.
Of PPE.
Yes.
And just of PPE.
It did occasionally. There were other bits of medical equipment that came across my desk, that were referred to me, but overwhelmingly PPE.
You have served over the course of a period of 18 years, between 2008 and 2016, as chair of the Conservative Party.
Yes. Well, I was deputy treasurer from 2005 2008. 2008 to 2010, I was CEO. And 2010 to 2016, I was chairman.
I see. Thank you for that correction. You were first asked, were you not, to volunteer by Lord James Bethell on or around the 20th of March 2020?
Yes, that's correct.
And you two knew each other socially and from your time as chair of Conservative Party?
Yes.
Yeah. He told you, did he not, that there were severe shortages of PPE and other critical equipment and supplies, and that the normal supply chain was not able to support the demand?
Yes.
Yeah. What reason did he give you specifically for enlisting your assistance?
Well, he knew that when I left the bar in 1995, my father was taken ill and I had to leave my chambers to go and run the family business, which was a clothing manufacturing business. And I ran that full-time for 10 years and part-time for another 12 years, so 22 years in total. And we essentially manufactured clothing for the UK high street, so lots of well-known high street names. And a lot of that sourcing, the overwhelming majority of the materials came from China, and the manufacturing was from across Asia, so China, Vietnam, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. So he knew that I understood supply chains, global supply chains, and understood sourcing.
Perhaps it's a shorthand, but is that the matter to which you refer at paragraph 4 of your statement when you say that your extensive business contacts would be useful to DHSC?
No, well, that's partly, yes, but I think also in my career, both in politics and then subsequently in business, I advise a lot of, and have advised lots of different companies. I know a lot of businesses, a lot of business people, both from within the clothing business and beyond.
You say that with one sole exception Bunzl, the contacts that you had or perhaps have were not within the medical equipment and supply business.
That's correct.
Did you feel, or do you feel, that that placed you at any disadvantage in the role you were asked to take up?
Normally speaking, in sort of peacetime, I would have been surprised to get the phone call. But in this particular situation, I understood from James and also just from reading the newspaper and watching the news that there were two massive challenges. One was that there was a desperate shortage of PPE, and by which I soon discovered it was days, not weeks' supply of PPE that were available, and that PPE in particular, things like masks and gowns, both in terms of the sourcing of the materials and in the assembly of them, resemble quite closely clothing manufacturing, because you buy the components and then you sort of send them to a different factory to assemble them. And so but I understood there was a desperate shortage in the UK, as I say, days of supply. And then the second thing was that I knew that, I suspected that the vast majority, the overwhelming majority of those materials came from a small number of factories in China, and that the pandemic had broken out in China, so there were 1.4 billion people that needed equipment, and then the rest of the world was descending on those factories, trying to get equipment. So it wasn't so much a question of needing deep technical knowledge, it was experience about how supply chains work and how one might be able to access different sources of supply, and access that narrow base of factories that were available.
I'll come on to it in a few moments,
Yeah.
but part of the reason for asking that particular question, Lord Feldman, is that unlike some of the other witnesses that have given statements and oral evidence to this inquiry. An example would be Michael Gove, who appeared and gave evidence earlier this week. You triaged or assessed offers as they came in.
Yes.
Mr. Gove described himself as a postbox, simply referring on offers that came his way. But is it right that you, when an offer came your way, assessed the credibility or the solidity of that offer before troubling others with it?
Yeah, so the way I would describe it is, I mean, just to give you some context, I was sitting on my own in my office at home. I never met any, apart from Matthew Hancock and James Bethel, I never met any of the people that I was interacting with physically. I never met Max Candarf or Andy Wood or Chris Hall or any of the other civil servants. I had 2 civil servants assigned to me who were and I was given a DHSC laptop, and they were to monitor all offers that I was given, and then they were to help guide me about how I could help, because I didn't really, as it were, see behind the curtain. I didn't really know how procurement was working in the department. I didn't have visibility. So my job was to, and as I say, there was a very narrow possible source of supply in China for this equipment, and my job was to try, through a series of questions, you know, when I was given an offer or where an offer came into me, to try and assess whether it was serious. That is to say, did that person have genuine access to potential large quantities of PPE in China? And did they have experience of dealing in China, which would make that interesting? And then, and were they did they seem like credible people when I spoke to them? And then I passed it on. But the process of technical assessment of the offer, deciding whether an order should be placed at what price, the logistics behind it, that all was sort of handed over to the civil servants.
So let me ask you this. Was either your role or the criteria that you applied to a given offer defined, set down anywhere?
I mean, well, I had a volunteering contract, and I was told by James what he wanted me to do.
Lord Bethel.
Lord Bethel, sorry. I was told by Lord Bethel what he wanted me to do.
And you directly reported to Lord Bethel?
I directly reported to him, yeah.
And what did he tell you, if he gave you any description of your role, what was it?
It was to, as I understood it when I arrived, the reason he phoned me was because the department was totally overwhelmed by offers of PPE, both through the sort of mailbox they set up and through recommendations from officials and MPs and ministers, and they couldn't really cope with sort of sorting the wheat from the chaff, working out whether these offers were even remotely credible. And so he said, I need you to cast your eye over some of the offers, that they'll be directed at you by officials, and to say, they might look good in the initial email, but is there anything behind them? And to give a sort of view, and if you think there is, then to either speak directly to the officials through the office, the sort of virtual office we set up for you, to sort of put them into the flow, and to help us to advance what could be interesting offers. And what I would say to you is, my sensation is that there were very, very few offers that were either not already being considered, not through the existing supply chain, not being considered, through, let's say, China, the embassy in China, that were credible, but you had to speak to a lot of people to establish, the 1 or 2 or 3 or half a dozen that could be potentially interesting. And so I could understand why they needed extra manpower to do that, because it was, I think at one point there were 7,000 offers.
So let me just focus you, before I turn to the deluge of offers, to the second part of my question. The criteria that you applied in assessing whether an offer was worth pursuing.
Yes.
Was that left to you? Was it a judgment that you exercised without guidance or without criteria set by anyone else?
I think it was, for the most part, although what happened as I started to interact with people like Andy Wood and Chris Hall, Max Kenduff, mainly Chris Hall, I started to get more of an understanding of the lessons that they were learning, of the things that were working and the things that weren't working, and also a bit more context about the broader backdrop of the offers that were coming in and the sort of supply constraints. So I would say that I started off with a short briefing, and then I kind of had to learn on the job.
Chris Hall, we can turn to it if you wish to, in his statement says that Lord Feldman was very effective at generating new leads.
Yeah.
He also says that his assistant frequently contacted the high priority lane seeking updates from the team in relation to contacts which Lord Feldman had introduced to the buy sell. Is that right? Did you frequently follow up to seek updates as to how offers that you had fed into the high priority lane were faring?
So the first, to answer the first part, which is the way in which I provided interesting leads, was by phoning people that my private office, the two officials, gave me to look up, or there was incoming people who knew me or knew I was involved in the process, approach me with sort of offers of help. So they were the two main sources. As I said, my actual knowledge of PPE suppliers in the world was, confined to Bunzl. But
so some came to you, others you went to.
Well, some came to no. Almost everything came to me, either through officials. Well, everything came to me through officials or through people contacting me directly. So, but what I would say, the description that he gives is these two very conscientious, hard-working officials that were assigned to me. They kept a sort of record of every single interaction I had, and they thought it was their job to then chase it up. The truth is, I would have had no idea how to chase it up, or indeed who to speak to. So they saw their job as, look, we brought Lord Feldman in. He's trying to help. He's triaging all these opportunities. Our job within the system is to make sure that they're being followed up.
Did the majority of those who came to you know you through the Conservative Party?
It was a mixture. A real mixture. I had some who knew me, and remember, these are referrers. So the suppliers themselves, no, none of them came to me through politics. Some of the referrers, people like Lord Lee, Lord Chadlington, they came to me because they knew me through politics, and then other people might contact me because they'd met me in business, or they'd heard that I was doing the job. Often it was simply that they'd heard that I was doing the job.
When you were assessing an offer for its credibility, was affiliation to the Conservative Party of the referrer
yes.
a factor in your assessment?
No, not at all. I was only interested in, is this something that's going to, help deal with this crisis? Is this a credible offer of equipment? I wasn't in the least bit interested about the political affiliation. And in fact, in terms of the suppliers themselves, I had absolutely no idea what the people actually doing the supplying. I, for the vast majority of cases, I had no idea what their political affiliation was.
Let's move on then to the requests for updates.
Yes.
We've heard a little bit about that up until now in this module. We know from Chris Hall's evidence, I think you've just confirmed it, you did on occasion follow up on offers that you had fed into the VIP lane or the high priority lane.
Lord Feldman said his officials did. He wouldn't know how to.
Oh, you asked that be done?
Well, not really, no. I think they just took it on themselves. The point is that James Bethell was dealing with an urgent situation, and he was conscious that I didn't really understand how the machine worked. And so what he did is he put in place, in 24 hours, the sort of what looked like a mini private office. So I had two officials working virtually. I was given a DHSC laptop and a mobile phone. And I was, and then, signed a volunteer agreement, filled out a declaration of interest or conflicts form, and off I went. Now, so I think the officials were instructed by James Bethell, Lord Bethell, to make sure that if I was what I was doing was effective. That if there was a good lead, it wasn't somehow lost in the system. So I think it was on their initiative, if I can say it that way. Yeah.
You've made that very clear. Yeah. Let's have a look at INQ 000551322, please.
Yes.
Now, I'm getting a bit frustrated. Let's take it from the bottom. Adam, this is very helpful. I've copied the UK PPE procurement team, who I'm sure will reach out to Redacted. So this is directly from you. Who's
Yes.
Adam, do you recall?
Adam is the person. So this is the little bit of context here. This was the 12th of April. Matthew Hancock, the Secretary of State, was extremely exercised about the shortage of gowns. I was told that there were 3 days' supplies of gowns in the system, and he and James Bethel, Lord Bethel, had communicated that to me, and it was real anxiety that. And frankly, I was hearing it from my friends who are doctors on the front line that people were possibly going to be sent in bin bags to turn patients on ventilators. It was very serious, and an opportunity came in through this company called 9 United, a guy called Adam Dancer, and he was. It came in to the Secretary of State. It came in to the officials, and I was asked to look at it, and it was quite exciting because 9 United was the procurement arm of a Danish retailer called Bestseller, a very large Danish retailer, which was already supplying PPE at scale to the Danish government. And I'll be frank, these kind of things didn't come in very often. It was a sort of hen's tooth. It was an established source of supply of gowns. I think they were offering over 1 million gowns a week. And it was already credentialised by the fact that it was being sold to the Danish government. So I was excited about this because I knew, and this was the time you recall where a shipment of Turkish gowns came in, which all had to be rejected, and it was a sort of front-page news story. So there was deep anxiety about it. So I was sort of excited about this. I thought, well, this could be a real thing. So
Why did you become frustrated, Lord Feldman?
Sorry, which one?
At the top, Adam, I'm getting a bit frustrated.
Who am I writing to? Adam?
You're writing to Adam.
Yes, and I'm just saying I'm getting a bit frustrated that this isn't being picked up because I think this is a great opportunity.
Yeah, is that not an example of you following up on an offer, on a possible opportunity?
Yeah, and I'm not saying for one moment that I didn't from time to time do that.
I thought you said you wouldn't know how, that others in your office would
this
do
is
it.
because I'd already specifically referred it to... Look, there's a difference between, and this is important, there's a difference between once I'd referred something, I think that this was referred to Max Kendorf. Once it had been referred to him, and then Adam, the supplier, phoned me up and said, look, it's not moving forward, and I'm worried we're going to lose the offer. I'm going to lose the opportunity to get the gowns. It would be natural for me to say, oh, that's annoying, that's frustrating, I don't know why no one's getting back to you. Let me give it a chase. And I think that's not the same as trying to understand how an offer which I've passed on has been acknowledged is then progressing through the different phases of technical assurance and all the different phases of the system.
Let's just look at the... Yeah. Let's go back to here. Do you see on this, on the screen... Yeah, it says, on behalf of COVID PPE Priority Appraisals Mailbox. Do you recognise that description? That's the VIP lane or the HPL?
Well, yeah, I'll be honest, I didn't really know. I mean, that was just a mailbox that I was told to send things to. I didn't ever have this phrasing in the high priority lane. I didn't really know what that was. That was just one of the inboxes in the same way that I had Max Cairndorf's email and Chris Hall's email that my officials told me to send things to.
Let's just finish up on this document. If we could scroll up to the top of it.
Yeah.
Max on it as well, you say. This is all on a Sunday, isn't it? 12th of April.
Yeah.
And then if we go back, that Hancock on PPE, do you have good enough leads into the system? Ministerially, it's not technically James's gig. Do you feel like you can get the system to respond? That's all to you.
Yes.
And then if we just look at the top, You reply, it's getting much better. Max and Chris seem more on it. Yesterday, I fed in 5 leads, 4 serious, and they followed up. When I sent stuff to Andy Wood, it seemed to die. He was overwhelmed. The Danish offer is a bit different and requires some flexible thinking, so it got stuck. Max now seems to be on it, although not sure why approval should take a few days. So this is an example, you would say, this is an example of an offer that is for some reason getting stuck and where you would intervene directly. Is that right?
Well, I think that, it's... When I say got stuck, what I'm referring to is it doesn't even get past the first base, which is it's not even being considered. And the reason this is, and the bit that's getting stuck is that there's an offer from the Danish government to speak to the British government about this route. So it's the sort of early stage of credentialising the offer. That's the bit that is concerning me, because I'm thinking this is something which is very unusual. It's a very unusual type of offer because it's already being used by another government, a friendly government. And so that's the bit that I'm trying to sort of move through. And it's within the first couple of days of the interaction.
Understood. I think it won't be controversial that other offers that came in that didn't catch your attention for whatever reason were unlikely to receive this sort of treatment unless there was some other senior referrer involved.
Well, I think I've explained to you why I thought this was very interesting, the combination of the timing, the product that was being offered.
Not quite what I was asking. You've explained why you were interested in this offer.
Yes.
There would have been a great many other offers of which you had no involvement, no knowledge, that simply wouldn't have had this treatment. They wouldn't have occupied any of your bandwidth. You mean offers
through other routes?
Through other routes?
I've got no idea.
You've got no idea.
Literally, I've got no idea.
All right. You say in relation to the high priority lane that you were unaware of it until you saw media reporting about it.
Yes.
Yeah. I've shown you one reference to an email that is a specific email for the high priority lane, but you never...
It's not described as that, though, is it? That's not what the email
But you worked
says.
with Max Canduff, didn't you?
Yes.
What did you think his role was? What did you think he did?
I know it's hard to imagine because it's sort of very not how these things work, but it was sort of like there was a curtain behind which different things were going on, the PPE cell, the high priority lane, ways of, as it were, that the civil service was designing to manage the vast amount of suggestions that were coming into them, which I was not privy to. I wasn't at the meetings, I wasn't in the discussions about the design of it. And it felt to me, if I can say, that this team were working really hard to sort of build the plane while they were flying it. This all happened, this is the 12th of April, the email exchange we was looking at. This is within days of them actually coming together as a team and trying to work out how to manage these offers. So I literally had no idea. For example, I didn't know whether Max Canduff was Chris Hall's boss or the other way around. I didn't know the relative seniority. I didn't know how they related to Andy Wood. They were just people whose emails I was given to get in contact with. And that's the sort of nature of my role. And I think it was, to some extent, deliberate, because I think that I was seen as I think Chris Hall describes me as an envoy. I was seen as a helpful envoy to triage some offers of help and feed them into the system. But how the system processed them, what they did with them, was invisible to me, which is why when something like the 9 United offer, felt like I was very excited about it and I couldn't see what was happening. It's because I literally couldn't understand what was happening to it. I couldn't see how it was being processed. So I was thought, look, don't miss this one. I know we're absolutely desperate for gowns, and I this is 1 million gowns a week. It's sort of possibly a really great opportunity. So that's the context.
Lord Feldman, I'm conscious of time. Let's move on, if we may. Paragraph 9, you tell us that you I'm aware that the HPL list published by the DHSC, I am described as the actual referrer to the HPL of 3 companies.
Yes.
Mazima, SG Recruitment, and Skinny Dip. Those, of course, are only they're the three that resulted in contracts, aren't they?
I've now found out. I had no idea.
But you must know that you referred in many more than 3 offers into the high priority lane.
Well, that's the point. I didn't know where. I mean, there were many more than 3, I suspect, offers that I triaged that ended up in contracts, but they may not have been defined, which was the definition which was operated by the department as suitable for the high priority lane. So I have no visibility about the offers I triaged, those I recommended, and those which ended up in purchasing. So I don't really know, but I'm now finding out through the evidence that's been shared with me that 3 of the 18 that were referred and which Chris Hall managed ended up in contracts.
Yeah, I think.
Do you see there's a distinction, because I wouldn't have known whether there were other offers that I might have put forward which weren't handled through the high priority lane, but I wouldn't have known that because I didn't know how they were processed internally, what qualified for that description.
We know also from Chris Hall's evidence that there, on some occasions you made explicit the connection with the Conservative Party, and on other occasions you did not do so.
No, so let me explain that.
Well,
because I can't recall every single offer that I might put forward, and I haven't seen all of the correspondence of every single offer that I put forward, I can't say with certainty whether I, in every single case, disclosed a connection with the Conservative Party. What I was endeavouring to do was 2 things. First of all, to credentialise the offer by saying, look, this has been introduced by somebody that I know. And the second thing, which I think is important, is to be completely transparent where there was a political connection, because I wanted to, I didn't want the person handling the opportunity to find out subsequently and think that somehow or other I hadn't been straight with them. So I was trying to be very, very open and transparent in the way in which I communicated about the offers. I mean, it may be that there are some offers that I didn't do that, but I can't recall.
we can turn to it if it helps.
Sure.
But what Mr. Hall says is that in some cases I was unaware at the time that the supplier had any link to the Conservative Party, while in others Lord Feldman made the connection explicit. So I suppose the question for you, Lord Feldman.
Well, just
hang on, if I could just pose the question, please.
Sure.
I suppose the question for you, Lord Feldman,
Yeah.
is this. If you were anxious, as you say you were, to be scrupulous about any possible connection to the Conservative Party,
Yes.
in order that anyone handling the offer should be aware of that, why is it that it was only on occasion that you made that explicit, according to Mr. Hall, but on other occasions you did not do so?
I think that he may be referring to offers that he saw, which possibly are ones that I didn't handle. So if you read it, I was unaware at the time that the supplier had any links to the Conservative Party, while in others Lord Feldman made the connection explicit. So I don't know, you'll have to ask Chris Hall. He might have been referring to offers through other referrers of suppliers, not me. But I think that, as I say, my recollection is that where there was a link, I made it explicit.
And when you made it explicit, it wasn't at all for the purpose of vouching for them in any way. I know this person through my connections. You can rely on what they are saying or offering.
Well, no, I think what I said just now was that to some extent, I was credentialising them. So if you imagine, I knew that their inboxes were full of thousands of offers of help. And so I was sort of saying, look, I know the person who's made this introduction is probably worth looking at. That's another factor to take into your mind, plus the point about demonstrating the Conservative connection, so that I was transparent about it.
Let's take a concrete example, if we may. SG Recruitment.
Yes.
It was an offer that resulted in 2 awards of a contract, wasn't it? One was for 2 million gowns, purchased at £23,899,000 via David Sumner.
Yes.
And the other was for hand sanitizer, purchased at £16,125,000 via Nick Mason.
Yeah.
And you're familiar with those two transactions?
Yes.
Yeah. SG Recruitment was introduced to you by Lord Chadlington.
Yes.
Is that right? You knew him through your life in politics?
Yes.
The initial contact that was made was via text message?
Yes.
Yeah. SG Recruitment is not Lord Chadlington's company, but he made the introduction.
Yes, that was my understanding. I think he might have been a director of it as well.
Well, we'll come on to that. I
Yeah.
think that's right.
Yeah.
David Sumner was the principal of SG Recruitment.
Yes.
Did you understand what was meant by the principal?
I think I probably took that to mean that he was the person running it.
Let's have a look at INQ 000510463, please. David Sumner wrote to you
Yes.
on the 21st of April 2020.
Yes.
Did you know David Sumner before this?
No. I'd spoken to him, I think. I can't remember if I'd spoken to him before or after this email, but briefly, yes. That was the first time I'd ever spoken to him.
You said on the 20th of April, this sounds very interesting.
Yes.
What was the basis upon which you thought that this offer was interesting?
Well, I think by this stage I'd spoken to him, and I think he'd actually sent me an email just before this on the 19th, setting out what he could offer. And then I think I'd spoken to him. I can't remember the exact sequence, but I spoke to him. What was interesting about him was that he was ex-military, he was ex-SAS. He was had done a lot of business in Asia, was very, very connected to factories in Asia, and had what looked like an impressive team of people supporting him. So he sounded like someone, just from speaking to him on the phone, who sounded interesting and passed that test that I set out earlier of being deeply connected in the Far East. So I was sort of thought this could, as I say, this could be interesting.
Did you form a view that he was what was the term you used, a good chap, or?
Yeah, I mean, look, I have to admit I had a slight soft spot for someone who told me they'd served in the military and was ex-SAS and credentialised themselves in that way. So I probably did think that he sounded like a sort of decent guy when I spoke to him. And I can remember him being articulate and impressive and also, into the detail.
And did you think that assessment that you made of him personally was relevant to assessing the offer that he was making?
Well, I think what it did was it meant that it certainly meant that it was worth. I thought it was worth the combination of all the things that I've set out meant that I thought he was definitely someone that Chris Hall should take a look at.
In your statement, you offer no further details about SG Recruitment, and you tell us that you no longer have access to the laptop and email address that you were using at the time because you returned those to DHSC in May 2020. The inquiry, though, has obtained further correspondence, which you have seen, I believe.
Yes, absolutely.
Of course, we also have Lord Chadlington's statement. Could we turn up his statement at INQ 000530462, Paris 6? We learn there that he was a non-executive director and non-executive chairman of Sumner Group Holdings. He's told the inquiry that he understood that one of the companies in the group has access to PPE. Did he explain to you the nature of his connection to SG Recruitment?
Well, he said in the email that Sumner sent me, and in what I sent on to Chris Hall, I said Lord Chadlington is a director, so he must have that must have been. I think that was in the original email. So yes.
And how did that affect the approach that you adopted to this offer?
Not at all, really.
As a non-executive director, did it not occur to you that Lord Chadlington held shares in SGH Limited, the value of which could be dependent on the success of the subsidiaries in the group?
I honestly can say at the time, obviously I've read all the materials now, at the time I didn't really enter my consideration.
Now that you have the opportunity to look back on it, should it have done?
Well, not really, because it's disclosed, it's transparent. Look, I think the way I look at this is that when you're in an emergency situation, you're always looking at a balance of risk. And so it's a factor to be considered. It's certainly a factor I would expect the transaction team to consider when it gets to the next stage of assessing the offer. But I didn't think that should, on its own, preclude me passing the offer on if I thought it was credible.
Well, perhaps not.
As long as it's disclosed, as long as it's sort of...
Lord Feldman, you indicated a few moments ago
Yeah.
that one of the reasons why, on occasion, you declared a connection to a Conservative Party member, say, is to ensure transparency. Why would it not have been that upon learning that Lord Chadlington stood to gain from a contract, were it to be awarded, you didn't make that clear on the correspondence?
Sorry, when did I learn that? Just a few weeks ago, when I got his statement. I didn't know that at the time.
Let's have a look at INQ 000 533 519.
From David Sumner to me, yes.
There it is. Lord Chadlington, towards the bottom, currently sits on the board of SGH Global.
Yes, I know. I knew that.
So it's not a couple of weeks ago, is it? This is April.
No,
So I think there may be a misunderstanding, Mr. Ward, with the question. I appreciate that appears to be the answer to your question, but I think...
No, what I was saying is, this is what I was saying to you. This is the letter of the 21st of April.
Yes.
In which he says that. And I when I refer the offer on, I say, Lord Chadlington is a director of the company. It's on the face of that initial correspondence. If you look at the correspondence, I was involved in the correspondence between the 19th and the 21st of April. After that, it sort of goes into the machine and they start to assess the offer. After the 21st of April, that's the end of my involvement in this. I leave it, the machine then makes its assessment. This is the first couple of days of to and fro of emails, and then it gets passed through to Chris Hall and the team to assess. And this is him setting out his credentials. Further to our telephone call yesterday is how the email starts, and then so we spoke. I thought, you sound like an interesting guy, quite impressive, and then he's credentialising himself at the bottom. And that's what I was referring to when I said he seemed to have good credentials, and more than just having been formed in the military, but actually having relevant connections in the Far East.
Let's just look at Lord Chadlington's witness statement now.
Yes.
INQ 000 530 462, paragraph 51. I'm afraid I don't have a page number here. There we are, thank you. On the 26th of April 2020, I responded to an email which Mr. Sumner had sent to me stating, fingers duly crossed, let's have a chat when we know where we are and what happens next, future orders, etc. I should, after chatting to you, talk to DC and to Feldman. Is that David Cameron and to Lord Feldman?
Yes.
They've been batting for us on this, and I want to say thanks for support, Peter. Mr. Sumner replied, most definitely, I'll call as soon as payment confirmed, which I expect will be tomorrow. David Cameron and Lord Feldman have been very supportive, to which I responded, yes, once money is in the bank, we can discuss next steps. Have a good evening and speak tomorrow. Peter, so what support is referred to here? Were you batting for Mr. Sumner in this case?
No, not at all. I mean, first of all, I can say that David Cameron, other than giving Pete Chadlington my mobile number, and that's sort of in the evidence, that's it. That's the extent of his involvement. As far as I'm concerned, the extent of my involvement is the initial exchange between the 19th and 21st of April, which you've seen, and that's it. I think Lord Chadlington is possibly operating under a bit of a misapprehension about what my role was. Once the offer passed into the system, it was really a matter for Chris Hall and the rest of the team to make the assessment. That's it.
All right,
he may have viewed me passing the offer on initially as being very helpful, but is not what is no different to what I've done for anybody who I thought had a credible offer of help.
Lord Feldman, let's just, to complete the picture, turn to the other aspect of the SG recruitment contract, which was awarded. This is for hand gel. Could we have INQ 000526-188 brought up, please? And just to remind, this was for £16,125,000, which was the purchase price. You tell us at paragraph 12 of your statement, the solicitors for the inquiry have also shared with me an email from Lord Chadlington dated the 19th of April, in which Nick Mason, who apparently had access to PP, I do not recall this email, I do not recall what happened as a result of the introduction. Well, here we have the following day, someone else, it's entitled, Nick's family are good friends with someone and with ours. He has access also to some PPE, which may help in current crisis.
Yes.
Nick outlined to Andrew what you can provide.
Yes, you only provided me with this email after my statement. So,
Well, you received it in April of 2020, did you not?
yeah, but to my DHSC email account.
Does that mean you wouldn't have seen it?
Well, I said in my statement I can't recall seeing it, and then because I don't have access to it anymore, then you've produced it for the purpose of this inquiry, and now, you know, I can now see it, and now I can remember it.
There may be a better version of it. Could we turn up 000510-462, please?
Yeah.
It's possibly a worse version of it, but...
you can see that sent to my DHSC.
I do see that.
Yeah.
Nick's family are good friends with David's and with ours. He has access to some. He has access to some PPE. You may have forgotten about this email until you were supplied with it a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
But we can now see that towards the end of April 2020,
Yes.
Lord Chadlington.
Well, it's the same day as the other.
Same day,
yeah.
points out that Nick's family are good friends with David's and with ours. Why do you suppose that might have been pointed out in this email? What relevance could it have to an offer coming in?
Frankly, in my view, none whatsoever. But if the offer was interesting, you know, on its merits, then worth passing on.
Thank you, Lord Feldman. Those were all the questions I had for you. I know that there may be questions from others.
There are, Mr. Weatherby, I think you're up now. Mr. Weatherby's just there.
Thank you very much. Lord Feldman, I asked questions on behalf of the COVID Bereaved Families for Justice UK group. Just a few questions from me. You've told us, now I'm not going to repeat it, that your role was triaging as a volunteer in this process. So you were influencing, you would say in a positive way, the process. So your role was to filter or to promote or to help prioritise offers in what was a civil service procurement process. Is that right? Is that a fair way of putting it?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think to filter and to identify interesting opportunities.
Okay, all right. Was it appropriate for a member of the House of Lords and a leading member of the governing party to be playing such a role in a procurement process by the civil service?
Well, the view I took was that, normally speaking, it would not be a role that I would take on.
Yes.
But in the crisis...
Okay.
Well, it's worth just making this point. In the crisis, you get a phone call from James Bethel and you have a choice. You either say, you know what, I'm not going to help. There's too much risk associated with it. You know, it's complicated. It's not a role that has historic precedent. I'll just sit on my hands. Or, at that moment, you say, well, I understand there's a risk. We'll do what we can to mitigate the risk by giving me civil servants and a DHSC laptop, and I will try to help in any way that I can. They're the choices that you're faced with at that moment. So the question of appropriateness is a very valid one to ask. But I'm just saying you have to contextualise it about the choices that you have to make at that moment.
So you're agreeing with me then, it muddies the waters, doesn't it, between
I don't think so, no.
political and the civil
No, because I think
service
the other thing to say in my experience of the civil service, almost invariable experience of the civil service, is they're perfectly capable, and every day they deal with the challenge of deciding, being faced by political pressure or a political judgment, and then having to make a judgment in their role as civil servants about what they perceive to be right for the country, what's in the best interest of the country.
Yeah.
I think the civil servants, in my experience that I dealt with, were more than capable of doing that. And in fact, their evidence consistently says that, which is that they made judgments, what they thought was in the best interest of the country, in the best interest of the procurement process. And yes, they may have found, politicians irritating, but they firmly and trenchantly stuck to their guns in making decisions.
Okay, but you really at least concede that in normal times it wouldn't be appropriate for you to do a role such as that, given your role in the...
I think in normal times I wouldn't be asked.
Yes. Okay, I'll move on. You've stated that with your discussion with Lord Bethell, you completed a conflict of interest form at the beginning of your placement. Did you ever give consideration to the potential for conflicts of interest in relation to the suppliers you were triaging? Was that something that you paid attention to?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
In particular because a lot of them were apparently people that you knew?
As I said, some of the people introducing suppliers I knew, the suppliers themselves, overwhelmingly I didn't know.
Yeah. And did you take account of whether individuals who were referrers of the companies had financial interest in the suppliers being promoted?
Largely,
it's an important question, isn't it?
It is an important question. Largely, that wasn't the case. We've just been discussing an instance where Lord Chadlington was a director of the company.
Yes.
I disclosed that. I didn't know whether he had a financial interest or not in the business at that time.
Yes.
I can't think of, at the moment, I can't think of any, I may be corrected, but I can't think of any others where the referrer had a financial interest in the company.
Yes, but was it something you asked them? I mean, here you are putting forward offers or promoting offers. Surely you would want to understand conflicts or potential conflicts or financial interests of people who are promoting them to you to promote into the system.
Generally speaking, the people referring the businesses pointed it out. So they made a point of saying if there was, like in the case of Peter Chadlington, that they were a director. In the other instances, I think I assumed not.
Yeah. Do you think, on reflection, you should in each case have made that clear with the
Are there
referrers?
instances where that happened that you're concerned about?
Well, I'm asking in each
No,
case.
what I'm saying to you is
do
that I'm not aware of any. I'm not aware of any instances where I referred people who had a financial interest. But I mean, I'm not saying it's not possible.
I'm looking at the process you engaged with.
Yeah.
I'm simply asking you whether this is something that you took care to approach.
Look, I'm hesitating in saying that I did, because in the heat of the moment, whether I did it invariably, I can't say for certain, but I certainly think that would have been something in my mind, yeah.
And in terms of SG recruitment, finally, you've been asked questions, so I'll be brief about this, but did you specifically ask David Sumner or Lord Chadlington to declare conflicts of interest or, particularly with Lord Chadlington, the fact of his financial involvement with SG recruitment?
I think when he said that he was the director, I sort of assumed that was sufficient. And you have to remember, as I said before, I was at the tip of the spear. There was an enormous machine of hundreds of people sitting behind me who went through technical due diligence, financial due diligence, logistics and delivery. So you're putting a lot of weight on me and actually as one person acting on my own. And perhaps I had more faith that the system that was sitting behind me, which had, as I now know, 500 people in it, would sort of address those concerns that you're now articulating.
Yeah. Okay. Finally, in terms of SG recruitment, you've given your account of the fact that SG recruitment had some contacts in the Far East and the Army connection, we know from disclosure that some of the products that were supplied by SG Recruitment were marked "Do not supply to the NHS" at the end because they weren't fit for purpose. This supplier was a recruitment company. It had no relevant trading history of itself. It had very low turnover for contracts of this magnitude prior to the pandemic. Apart from what you said, was there any basis for promoting SG Recruitment in the way that you did?
Well, I think, first of all, promoting, you can see the correspondence. If you view that as promoting, then that's your word, not mine. I think I passed them on because I spoke to Mr. Sumner and he seemed like a credible, knowledgeable person who might be to help. The question of what was bought, how much of it was bought, what was paid for it, where it came from, how it was technically checked, how it was delivered, these were matters which were not in my remit and which there was teams of hundreds of people to attend to. And I believe all of them, in my experience, worked very hard to get to the right conclusion. It is, of course, the case in a wartime situation, which frankly is what this was, that mistakes will be made. I suspect if one analysed the recruitment practices of the British government at the commencement of the Second World War, you would see all sorts of things.
I don't think we go to the Second World War.
No, but I mean, but what I'm saying to you is that you're placing a prism on this team, this hard-working team of civil servants, which is, I'm afraid, inevitably carrying the weight of hindsight. But it's not being very forgiving given the situation that they were facing.
I'm just asking you questions, Lord Feldman.
No, I understand.
Thank you very much. Have we agreed on question, Ms Mitchell, that I've allowed you to ask?
I think we have. I'm obliged to counsel to the inquiry who asked many of my questions, but I think we've now agreed on one. It follows on in the questions that you've just been asking, just been answering in relation to Mr Sumner. You've explained that you're doing a triage system, that you were credentialising the offer, and you explained in relation to Mr Sumner that you had a certain fondness due to the fact of him having been in the military and an SAS man. Can I ask you if you asked him certain questions, and I think I may already know the answer to this, but if I can just ask you to clarify. Did you ask him, for example, how long his company had been trading?
Look, I don't want to misspeak. If you imagine this is 5 years ago.
Indeed.
I was having multiple conversations a day. I can't actually remember my conversation other than what's set out in the correspondence, which is he seemed like an interesting, credible person. I suspect that I didn't ask him how long the company had been trading. It's possible that I did, but I can't honestly recall.
You see, it's the inquiry has heard that in order to triage offers, that questions were asked, for example, how long had a company been trading, whether or not it was trading a profit or loss, whether or not it ever traded PPE. And I wonder if I can ask you to comment on this. It sounds like what you were triaging was people rather than offers.
I think that, I think certainly what I was, and it's a very fair comment, what I was doing was I was trying to make a rapid assessment of whether an offer was credible enough to go to the next stage, and by which I mean whether from what I said at the beginning was there a proximity to the Chinese market? Was it an offer which is sufficient scale to move the dial in a situation where the volumes needed were enormous? And was the person knowledgeable about the product area in a way that made it interesting? The questions of whether the company had been trading a long time, the creditworthiness of its balance sheet, all of those aspects were definitely not for me. They were definitely handled by the specialist teams further down the line. And you can see that in the correspondence. If you look at what was done after I'd passed it on by the professional team, they looked at things like the balance sheet of the company and its trading history and,
Indeed,
its corporate structure. So my point is it was done, but that wasn't by me.
Milady, no further questions.
Thank
I think
you
my
very
point
much,
is made.
Ms Mitchell. Thank you very much, Lord Feldman. I may just give you for that dreadful word, credentialise. I can't even say it. But thank you very much for your patience in waiting so long to come on, and thank you for your help for the inquiry.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Very well, 10 o'clock tomorrow, please.
All right.